The text that's going to engage us this morning is from our Old Testament lesson, Isaiah chapter 40, the first 5 verses. You'll find it on page 4 of your service folder if you'd like to follow along. Would you join me in a word of prayer? O Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer.
Amen.
You may be seated. I moved here from a city in the heart of our country, which had interstates going in various different directions. Interstate 70, Interstate 55, Interstate 44, Interstate 270, Interstate 255, Interstate 64. And I moved here to a city that has one interstate. Interstate 90. Although, even though we're just a one interstate city, we can be proud of our interstate. Because did you know our interstates, Interstate 90, has the world's second longest floating concrete bridge. And it's actually here in Washington. If you're going towards Seattle, it's the one that takes you across Lake Washington. And our interstate is the only one of all of them in the interstate system that has a portion of it designated as part of the National Scenic Byways Program. And it is the section that's in Washington. It's called the Sound to Mountains Greenway. And our interstate goes through more states than almost any other. It goes through 13 different states. The only one that goes through more is that one that goes up through all those little miniature states along the East Coast, I-95. But we go through the big states, like the state of Montana, and still cover all that territory. And we're the only interstate that has a section of it that, for a time, didn't even have a speed limit. The section of the interstate that goes through Montana. And still, we are the longest of all the interstates in the interstate system. Over 3,000 miles this interstate stretches from Boston, Massachusetts to Seattle, Washington. Although we couldn't claim that until after 1991 because of Wallace, Idaho. Yes, because Wallace decided to establish their downtown as a National Historic Registry of Places, and so the engineers who were designing the interstate system had to come up with other solutions to try to get through that narrow passage of the mountains, because they couldn't bring the mountains down or make them lower. They couldn't raise up the valleys and make them plain. And so how were they going to get through Wallace, Idaho now? 1991, they opened up an elevated section of I-90 that went through the north side of Wallace, Idaho, removing the last stoplight on I-90, and finally the whole thing was connected. You can find out those fun facts and a lot more like that on the Federal Highway Administration's Fun Facts publication. But that inspired me, thinking about these highway fun facts, to talk about a few fun facts of the Highway of the Lord. And so the Highway of the Lord was not paved by workmen, but by words. And the Highway of the Lord stretches longer than any other interstate in our interstate system, because it stretches not from geographical place to geographical place, but it stretches from heaven to earth. And the Highway of the Lord passes over some truly rugged terrain, from mountains to valleys, from wilderness to deserts. The Highway of the Lord is a place, even though it stretches longer than any other highway, even though it goes over such rugged terrain where there is neither incline nor turn, but it is straight and level the whole way. And the Highway of the Lord is more beautiful than anything on the scenic byway system, because on the Highway of the Lord, the glory of the Lord is revealed, and all flesh shall see it. And you won't find these kinds of things on the fun facts of the publication from the Federal Highway Administration, but you will find them in Isaiah's prophecy, chapter 40, what we had today. Specifically, if you look at verse 3, a voice cries, "In the wilderness prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be lifted up, every mountain shall be made low. The uneven ground shall become level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken." Verses 3 to 5. Isaiah chapter 40. Why all this talk about highways? I mean, our God doesn't drive a car, does he? And what about Isaiah's day? I mean, Isaiah didn't know what a car was. In his day, people are still traveling on donkeys. So why all this talk about highways? Did you know that 2 of the most heavily traveled highways in antiquity went alongside of Israel on either side? They ran north to south, connecting all the civilizations and cities of Egypt and Africa to all the civilizations and cities in the Levant and Mesopotamia on that Fertile Crescent. And they ran right alongside Israel. One to its west, along the Mediterranean coast. It was called the Derek Hayam, the Way of the Sea. And the other one to the east, across the Jordan River from Jerusalem, in the highlands along the ridge, and it was called the Derech HaMelech in Hebrew. It's the Way of the Kings, or the King's Highway. Now, the King's Highway, that's the one that the Israelites needed to travel on to get to the Promised Land when they were coming back from the Exodus. And so they asked permission from the kings who controlled the King's Highway if they could cross on it. And the king said, no, you can't. And so they ended up doing battle, and the Lord gave them victory so that they could pass. Because the King's Highway was a way to get through that desert region where there were wells and freshwater springs at regular intervals. And it was wide open space on that mountain ridge that people could move. And they would come there. And the Way of the Sea was another one of these that went along through Philistine territory and then up alongside the Israelite territory up to the north. And these different ancient trade routes of antiquity, these highways, were used by Israel later in their history, by David and by his son Solomon. This is how they got to expand the kingdom commercially. And it brought a lot of prosperity to Israel because they were so close to these ancient trade routes. But it also brought the enemies of Israel upon it. The Way of the Sea was the way that Assyria came in Isaiah's day, and marched its armies into North Israel and destroyed all of North Israel, and then went down into Judah and began doing the same to all the cities in Judah until it encircled Jerusalem itself and laid siege to Jerusalem. And that is actually what the first 39 chapters of Isaiah are all circling around about. So Isaiah is visioning in chapter 40 a new kind of highway. Not a Derech Hayam, not a Way of the Sea, not a Derech HaMelech, not a Highway of Kings, but a Derech Yahweh, a highway for the Lord. That the Lord would come on and he would bring his salvation. Now Isaiah has already said back in chapter 9 that this way of the Lord would come from the same way that the Assyrians came and brought destruction. The Assyrians came by the Way of the Sea and brought destruction down from the north. And Isaiah says that we will see the Lord come from that direction too when he sends his Messiah. And so in Isaiah chapter 9, he said, but there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish in the former time when she was brought into contempt in the land of Zebulun and Naphtali. But in the latter time he is made glorious, the Derech Hayom, the Way of the Sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. On those who dwelt in the land of deep darkness, a light has shined. This light that's shining from that direction and the coming of the Messiah is the glory of the Lord. It's the same thing that Isaiah is talking about in Isaiah 40 when he says that on the way of the Lord, on the highway of our God, the glory of the Lord shall be revealed. And yet this glory of the Lord doesn't come in the way we might expect. If the Assyrian armies marched their troops and their military might down the Way of the Sea to get into Israel. And now Isaiah is saying the Messiah is going to come that direction, and the Lord is coming in that direction. Then we might expect, well, he's going to come on some kind of chariots or fire the way he showed up in the days of Elijah. Or he's going to come maybe on the wings of some heavenly creatures like cherubim, like Ezekiel pictures in chapter 1 and 2 of his prophecies. But Isaiah says something different. Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The Lord was not going to come in all of his pomp circumstance. The Lord was not going to come in that sort of fashion, but instead was going to come in humility. The Lord was not going to come riding on some kind of heavenly ride, but he was going to come clothed in our humanity. The Lord was not going to come bringing with him all the angels and their armies, but he was going to come as an infant in Mary's arms. And yet, in his coming, he would bring a righteousness and a holiness that this world had never seen. These other highways, the Way of the Sea, the Highway of Kings, well, they were used for good in Israel's time, but they were also used for Israel because because the wicked passed on them too and brought destruction to Israel. But Isaiah envisions that on this highway, when the Lord brings it, only holiness will be there. And so even though this little child would be born into our flesh, he would not partake in our sinfulness. And so Hebrews chapter 4, verse 12 says that as he grew up, he was tempted in every way, just as we were, and yet was without sin. Isaiah had foretold that in chapter 35. Isaiah talks about the coming of the Lord. And he says, strengthen weak hands, Isaiah 35, verse 3, and make firm the feeble knees. Say to those who have an anxious heart, fear not, be strong, behold your God will come. He will come and save you. And then down in verse 8, he says, and a highway shall be there, and it shall be called the way of holiness. And the unclean shall not pass over it. It shall belong to those who walk along the way. Do you notice what Isaiah is saying there about the coming of our God? And not only does our Lord come on this highway, but we are invited to walk upon it too. It shall belong to those who walk upon the way. And if we're going to walk upon that way, then we need to share in that holiness, because there is no sin that's going to travel on that highway. And so this is where 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 21 reminds us. God made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, so that we might become the righteousness of God, so that we might be invited to be on this highway. So if you want to think of this as an interstate highway, I invite you to think of it that way. I mean, it's not just an international highway, like the highways, the way of the sea, or the way of the kings was in Isaiah's day. And it's not just an interstate like the interstates in our day. They go from one state in our nation to another state in our nation. But if you want to think of this as interstate, then think of it as interstate taking us from the state of sin to the state of God's grace. Because when we're invited to be on this highway, we are invited to travel with the Lord in his grace, and we live in that grace. And we live on this highway that our Lord has provided for us. It's a highway in which our God comes to us. And because he comes to us in Jesus, we are invited to come to him. Except that I think sometimes we forget whose highway this is. And we forget how we got on this highway. Maybe forget's too strong a word. Sometimes we neglect. Yeah, that's better. We get distracted. And we neglect to pay attention to the God whose highway this is. It's not often that North Idaho ends up in our national news. And when a news story hits the national scene from the Idaho Panhandle, we think it's got to be something really grievous. Well, a few years ago, there was a story that went to the Associated Press and spread across this country from the Chicago Sun-Times to the ABC online news. And it was a story about a car chase that took place on US 95 running north in North Idaho. And the car chase went for 15 miles, a police chase, ended with spike strips, and they finally apprehended the person who was driving the car. And it made national news, but not because this person who was leading the police chase was some kind of a criminal or a murderer or done anything like that. In fact, the person who was driving the car the whole time never went over the speed limit. He went very careful, 50 to 60 miles an hour the whole way. Even stopped at one point near Elmira, North Idaho here, because there was a car in front of them on US 95 who was making a left turn. And so they stopped patiently behind that car, waited for the left turn while police are behind chasing, and then started going again. The police chase didn't stop until there were spike strips, and yet the car did, because as the car pulled up to the spike strips, it noticed something was a little odd. The car stopped for a minute, and then drove over the spike strips, and then paused for a minute, wondering what just happened, and then tried to go again, but because 3 of the tires were blown out, it couldn't go, and so the police finally apprehended the person driving it. Nita Friedman was her name. And she wasn't from North Idaho, she was from New York. But the reason this car chase happened was because she didn't realize the police were following her. She knew somebody was trying to get her attention, so at one point she had pulled off the road and then changed her mind and turned back on the road and then kept driving. It's because the police car didn't look like what she expected a police car to look like. It was a Chevy Silverado with flashing lights in the grill, and she thought, this can't be a police car. This is somebody weird from North Idaho that's following me. Until they finally apprehended her, so she just kept going and going and going. I think this is the way we are a lot of times. I mean, we're invited to be on this highway of our God. We are here because of God's grace and because of his righteousness and his forgiveness. And he has declared us holy. He has placed us on this highway. And yet, sometimes we neglect to pay attention to him. And this Jesus, who we're supposed to be following on this highway, because he is our way, our truth, and our life, right? We're supposed to follow him. We kind of just get going and going and going and don't even realize that he's been behind us for a long time. And he's been trying to get our attention. We're all guilty of this. And it's not some malicious evil or terrible sin where we're really harming other people, but it is sin. And because of it, we need God's grace and we need God's forgiveness. And Advent is a good time for us to hear that. So we need to hear this prophecy of Isaiah from Isaiah chapter 40. And not just about the highway of our God in chapters 3 and verses 3 through 5, but we need to hear verses 1 and 2 as well. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to her. Cry to her. And her iniquity is pardoned. She has received from the Lord's hand double for all her sins. Now Isaiah is speaking that to the people who live in Jerusalem. But as God's people who've been called to be a part of this highway, he's speaking it to us too. I don't need to just say it to Jerusalem. I can say it to you. Comfort, comfort my people, says your God. Your iniquity is pardoned. You've received from the Lord's hand double for all of your sins. You say, double for sins. Double what? Double fees for traffic violations, double penalties for all of our wrongs. Nita Friedman, she got jail time and $600 bail. Double that? $1,200? No. Isaiah chapter 40. Comfort, comfort. Double comfort. Double grace. Double forgiveness is what Isaiah is proclaiming to God's people. And why double? Because when the Lord forgives, he always gives us more than we need. There'll never be a sin in our life where there's just not enough God's grace to go around, where we have to try to atone for some of that on our own in some way. But instead, God gives us all of the grace we need, and he fills us with that forgiveness. We live in that state of grace, and it is a joy to be a part of it. And because he has proclaimed that to us, that double forgiveness in Christ Jesus, for all of us who believe in him and believe him to be the way of the Lord that has come to us, and through his death and resurrection, he has taken our sin. Because of that, we are on this highway of our own. And we have the opportunity to invite others to be on that highway with us. And that's what God wants us to do. Al Schultz is a retired Lutheran pastor here in Spokane. He attends Redeemer Lutheran Church down in Spokane Valley. And he also serves as a part-time chaplain at the VA hospital. But a few years ago, he told a story to me about his life in the ministry. He spent most of his ministry life as a missionary in Papua New Guinea. And he relayed a story to me that he gave me permission to share with you. And I did at the time a few years ago, but some stories bear repeating. So this one I will, especially in relation to what we've been talking about today. While he was a missionary in Papua New Guinea, he had rallied his village together to take on an enormous project, to build an airstrip. Because there's no highways where he was in Papua New Guinea, no interstate traffic, because this island has some of the tallest peaks of any island in the world. It has mountain peaks topping 16,000 feet. The island is twice the size of Great Britain, so it's fairly small. And with that kind of rugged terrain, all of the villages that are in the highlands of that island were all separated and isolated from another. There was no way to build roads in between them. And because of that, Papua New Guinea, still today, is one of the most culturally diverse places in all of the world. 836 indigenous languages are still spoken on that island by different groups of people living up isolated in those highland areas. And so there was one village in particular where Al Schultz was working with the people of that village, and he knew if he was going to be able to bring the gospel to more people than just his village, they needed to have a way to get from one village to another. They needed to build an airstrip. And we're not talking about concrete and lights. We're just talking about a level area of gravel and dirt, 1,000 feet long, that bush planes could land on and take off from. And so he rallied his village together, expecting this is what God was calling him to do, and told them what he wanted them to do and got them excited about it, and they started into their work by hand. They had to build this airstrip and carve it out of the hillside by hand. And when I say by hand, they used picks and they used shovels, and they didn't even have a wheelbarrow, he said. Their most advanced technology was they had 55-gallon drums. And so they would shovel dirt into a 55-gallon drum and put the lid on it, and they didn't have the thing that closes the lid, so they had to tie it together with twine that they got from the local trees, and then once it was full, they would roll it down the hill. And when it got to the bottom of the hill, they would follow it down there and take the top off and dump the dirt out, and then they would roll it back up to the top. Can you imagine doing that for 3.5 football fields to try to level the ground so that they would have an airstrip? Well, he said they had a good turnout, and it felt like God was really blessing it, because 55 people from that village came out, 55 men, to help with all of this. And the first 300 feet went really smooth. He said after that, the men who were working on it started to complain and get tired. And then they started getting angry because they weren't getting paid. And they demanded that they should get paid for this. But Al said there was no money for this. He didn't, every bit of money they had, they put into picks and spades so they could do the work. And they had saved a little bit for a celebration at the end. But there wasn't enough to pay these men to do the work. And so they essentially went on strike. And they said, we're not going to do it if we're not getting paid. And so here's this partially finished airstrip outside his village. He said, this is the way the highlands of Papua New Guinea were. There were partially finished and unfinished airstrips next to all sorts of villages in the highlands because the work was never completed on them. And he thought, is this just doomed to be another one of those wasted efforts? And so he began to pray to the Lord about it. He went to the Missionary Society to see if he could get some money, maybe to pay these workers to finish it. And that wasn't working. And he started to think, Lord, am I really following you in this? Have I just been going out and doing something on my own, or are you really leading this? And in a last-ditch effort, with a pen and a prayer, he wrote a letter to the village close to them. He said, if your men will not come, will you at least send your women and children to come on Monday and help work on this? And each Monday until it's finished. And then he wrote another letter to the village on the other side. And he said, if your men won't come, will you at least send your women and children on Tuesdays until it's finished to come and help us work on this? And he sent another letter to another village in the other direction and said, if your men won't come, will you at least send your women and children to come on Wednesdays until it's finished? And did this for each day of the week. And the women came and they completed this and they prepared the way of the Lord. Whoa, you say, wait a minute, I thought they were preparing an airstrip. What do you mean they're preparing the way of the Lord? Is God coming on an airplane or something? No, if the men would have finished this, the men in his village, this would have only been an airstrip. But because the women and the children finished it, when they came from the other villages, they came to his village and they heard about the message of Jesus. And then they carried that back to their villages and began talking and sharing the news with other people. He said by the time this airstrip was finished, they had more villages wanting to hear the news about Jesus than they had people to go and tell them. See, when we are following the Lord on his highway, there is no limit to what he can do. I pray that resonates in your mind this Advent season. Travel the highway of our Lord. In Jesus' name. Amen.